All right. Well, good noon, everybody. Welcome back to Lunch Break Apostasies. Glad to have you with us. Last week we talked a little bit about the Restoration movement. Of course, that's a bit different than the things we've dealt with so far, and a couple of ways it's a little similar to the Judaism lesson we went through, in which we talked about how, while Judaism itself is not an apostasy, especially, or rather, I should say, was not an apostasy, it of course ended up being highly involved with what we consider apostate sorts of behaviors and the modern practice of the religious Judaism. Of course, we're not talking about somebody who is ethnically Jewish, but the practice of the religiously Jewish is still just as apostate as anything else. And it's a very similar story with the Restoration movement. The Restoration movement, at its core, what it ought to be is simply let's restore the Bible, which is to say, let's take man out of the equation entirely and go back to exactly what the Bible says, which is where we ought to be precisely. Now, on that, one of the things I normally like to do with these is to mention something that's good that comes out of that. Well, there's a lot good that comes out of that. Unfortunately, some bad things came out of the Restoration movement as well, not necessarily from that concept, let's go back to the Bible, but rather the corruption of man. Just like the original church was corrupted, the Restoration movement also was corrupted. That really shouldn't surprise us. But if we want to look to something that you don't see anymore, at least in much of the modern restoration movement, that I kind of wish we still had, it would be this emphasis on the union of everybody who would call themselves Christians. Now, please don't misunderstand me on that. When somebody says something like that, we tend to immediately jump to the modern eclectic movement. As we mentioned last week, that's not a good thing. It says, yes, we need to unify, but it says, let's unify essentially on nothing. Or it's going to pick and choose which bits of scripture we need to unify around. Can't do that either. We don't have the authority to say, yes, this scripture is important, no, this one's not. If God put it in there, all of it's important. So that's what we need to unify around. But I'm afraid because of the modern eclectic movement, some in the restoration movement have begun to feel like the idea of unification is almost a dirty word. Well, no, it's not. We ought to be unified. I would desire that all Christianity be unified under the Bible, and I would desire that all the world be Christian. So unification is a good thing, and something maybe we ought to think about more as members of that restoration movement. All right. This week we are going over Mormonism. Now, this one's going to be a little bit different than some of the ones we have dealt with before. One of the rules that I've mentioned multiple times is the pigeonholing rule when it comes to studying with somebody who is a member of an apostasy. And the pigeonholing rule is just because this is generally the doctrine that is taught within the church. That doesn't mean that the person you are talking to believes it. And this, by the way, applies universally. You can't tell somebody else what they believe in. That being said, when it comes to the Mormons, probably more so than anybody else that we have dealt with, you can be pretty confident of what this person believes before you've spoken a word to them. Once again, you still can't pigeonhole them. But unlike many other denominations, the Mormons have a very strong grip on the beliefs of their membership. By the way, when I say Mormons, I am specifically talking about the group of Mormons that would identify themselves as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. That's the main group of Mormons. There were a few splinter groups, there always have been. But I'm talking specifically about these people, and those are the ones that you usually associate that stereotypical two young guys who are dressed in black pants, white dress shirt, tie, and a little name tag that identifies them as Elder so and so. That would be the LDS Church. Um, and like I said, you can really know a lot about what they believe before you've spoken a word to them, which makes them unique. Now, once again, still be careful. Don't pigeonhole. And you can't use this information to say, I know exactly what you believe. But it's good to have a good idea about what you're going to be dealing with, especially and since they're so predictable, once again, not 100%, but because they tend to be more predictable than other apostasies, strategy for talking with them can be a little bit more precise. And so something I don't do as much of. I give little snippets here and there, but I don't often talk about the strategy when it comes to evangelizing somebody in a particular apostasy because I'm afraid of pigeonholing. I'm going to make an exception on this one, and the last thing we're going to do is talk about strategy with this one because the playbook is so universal. All right. So, what is Mormon? Oh, another thing we have to talk about. I've made a couple of mentions about the word cult. When it comes to studying the Bible with somebody, typically, actually, let's see how I can multitask here because I just realized I have my system up wrong here. But typically, when it comes to studying the Bible with somebody, um, even if they are a member of a cult, like without doubt, um, it's not wise to mention the word cult. It's just not going to be helpful in getting to some sort of understanding with somebody. It's just such a loaded term that's so poorly defined. Um, you're not usually gonna have a lot of good by introducing the term cult. I mean, even if you see somebody mid-sacrificing a goat, don't say that they're part of a cult, even if it's 100% true. One, there's not a universally agreed definition of the term cult. Two, many people's definition of the term cult would include literally any religion within it. So it's an extremely unhelpful term as well. However, I am going to use the term a few times here, not because I'm using this to insult anybody, but I do think that the term cult, if used within a proper definition, and once again, there's not a universally agreed upon definition of the word cult, but if used within a proper definition, it can really help to explain some of the behaviors, particularly of the founders of said cult, right? Not all Anabaptists were members of a cult. I don't think so. When you look back to the Middle Ages, but those who were following Melchior Hoffman and then later took over the city of Munster, those guys were absolutely members of a cult, and they followed a certain playbook. You can kind of understand their motivations, and you can kind of predict where things are going to be going. A lot of these things will apply. Islam, a lot of the same rules apply with Muhammad as you do with a cult. So my loose definition of the term cult, which Mormonism is going to fall under, is a is a religious movement, not small necessarily. Of course, they're all going to start small. It is a religious movement with an extreme emphasis on the founder. Now, once again, somebody could say that, well, that's Christianity would fall under that, which is true, which is why I don't think it's a good enough definition. Extreme emphasis on the founder of that religion, and then you have an alteration of a previous religion in order to make that fit. For our purposes, that's what I'm going to call a cult, or rather, let's say it for what I'm really focused on here, Christian cult, because of course you can have cults that aren't Christian cults that tend to focus on the same way. Now, almost every single cult does that, but technically I think there are things that you could fall under the idea of cult that don't do that third thing, but every Christian cult is going to do it. So, extreme emphasis on the founder, obviously religion, and then alteration of a previous religion in order to make that one work. This is how, for example, I would call Islam a cult, right? It alters Christianity. Jesus is not actually the Son of God. He was just a prophet. A lot of emphasis on Muhammad. In order to become a Muslim, you must speak the words, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet, right? So you have those two factors going in there. And Mormonism is a very similar experience, you'll find. Alteration of the previous religion to benefit the founder. And we'll see that a lot. So, We've mentioned the founder being very important. Who is this important founder of Mormonism? Well, that would be a fellow by the name of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was born in December uh, 23rd, a couple days before Christmas, 1805, in Sharon, Vermont. He later, still within his childhood, moves to western New York in a town called Palmyra, and it's an area that is known as the Burned Over District. His family had moved all around North America, mostly New England, for quite some time before settling in Palmyra. And the reason Palmyra was called the Burned Over District is because of the waves of evangelical fervor that would seem to sweep it up. This is in the midst of the Second Great Awakening, and so you have evangelical fervor all over America, but apparently, particularly Western New York was famous for this. And so you have a lot of these preachers coming around, and Smith was naturally exposed to a lot of religion as a child. His family was divided, religiously speaking. I believe his mother was a devout Presbyterian, and his father was a Universalist, meaning it's something similar to a lot of religious people today, where it's I'm religious but not spiritual. I think God is in everything. That sort of thing is what appears to be the beliefs of Joseph Smith Sr. And you also have something going on in this district where there is a lot of folk magic, um, superstitions believed in Western New York at that time. That'll also play an important part in the story to unfold. It said that he had a slight limp all his life. He grew up in a very large family, as a lot of people did in his time, I believe. It was somewhere in the teens of the amount of siblings that he had. He always had a slight limp because he had a shin infection as a child. This was sort of the big heyday for amputations for everything. He actually sort of lucked out in that he had a doctor who was a big advocate for less amputations, and so he simply removed a lot of the bone from his shin, which was extremely painful. It said that Joseph was very close with his brother Hiram, who supported him during this time. Extremely painful, traumatic childhood because of this infection and a lot of other things going on, and it affected him through his whole life. He apparently stood out from his siblings. His mother described him as less given to the reading of books as a child and more given to meditation. And he had a fascination with American Indians and their history as well. This will also play into some of the things we're going to see later. He came from a very spiritual family. His father, mother, and maternal grandfather all claimed to have visions at one point or another. And so you have this setup for this kid. He's born in an extremely religiously turbulent place in an extremely religiously turbulent time. Uh, Exciting, not in a good way, but exciting childhood. Very much ingrained with folklore and the history of the place that he's in, and he's sort of taught that the idea of visions are a normal thing within his culture. And so it makes sense then that as a very young man, he would receive some visions of his own. By 1820 or 1821, depending on who you ask, he receives his first vision. It said that he was distressed by the religious division that he saw, and he goes out to a grove by himself, and he prays fervently to God to ask him which of the Christian denominations is right. And he gets his first vision from God telling him that all first of all, he says that your sins are forgiven, that you, and then he says that all of the Christian denominations are false and all of them have been corrupted. And this is where it gets interesting, from the original church, and that Joseph had been selected to restore that original church. And this is the phrasing that the LDS, that's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS, Latter-day Saints, that's still the exact phrasing they will use as their mission. Does that sound familiar to you if you were watching last week? Well, it just so happens this is sort of during the height of popularity from people like Alexander Campbell. And it's very likely that Smith stole a lot of ideas, and I'm not upset at him for getting an idea to restore the church. Campbell doesn't own the idea of restoring the church. You see people in the Bible restoring people back to the law of God all the time, so he doesn't own the idea. The problem really shows up when Smith decides, or well, according to the Mormons, this is what he's told. Um, Instead of go back to the Bible and do what is told in there, what you have to do, Joseph, is wait, and I will reveal to you another gospel that has been lost. So we mentioned that difference between the eclectic movement and the restoration movement. The eclectic movement says, let's unite and have one church, but ignore all of the differences and thus not really unite at all. And also, there's a bunch of people we're not actually going to unite with, but we're going to pick and choose what those differences are, in which case you've created a new denomination. Remember, we were talking about some Catholic history, and at one point there were three separate popes. How did we get that third pope? Well, it was a big problem. We got two popes, so let's make one pope, and then he'll be the one. Well, now you just end up with a third pope. That's sort of what the eclectic movement does. The restoration movement solution is get rid of man's involvement, period, and just go back to what was happening in the Bible in the first century. Smith's solution is we need a new gospel entirely in order to unify the church. And that's what he says God says to him. It's a little unclear, but I think my points here might be a little bit out of order, and I apologize for that. But before this, he had already been practicing divination, by the way. Remember, this is a superstitious place. And he had been practicing divination. He had this seer's stone, learned from some woman, I believe, who showed him how to find his own seer's stone. And it was this, small, smooth, chocolate-colored stone. And what he would do is he would help people try to find ancient treasures. And he would put this in a stovetop top hat. I think something Abraham Lincoln would be wearing. And he would place his head in the hat, and supposedly, when he was looking down into the hat, the seer stone would glow, and he'd be able to find things like that. And so he was famous for being a treasure hunter. He lived, by the way, well into his 20s with his parents in their extremely small rustic cabin. Very little luxuries, very poor. But he was a famous treasure hunter. Um, and one of the more famous ones, he sort of got in legal trouble at one point when he was hired to find what some people believed was an old Spanish mine. What was in the mine was a little unclear. Some said gold mine, silver mine, whatever. And he had worked with these people to find this mine for quite some time, and then they got supposedly within 20 miles of it, and then he says, I can't find anything over that. So there was legal troubles. Um, you know, this is actually how he ends up meeting his wife, though, because one of the financiers was a man named Isaac Hale. He actually lived with Isaac while he was working this project, and his daughter, Emma, Joseph fell in love with her. He asked Isaac's permission to marry her. He says no, and they end up getting eloping and getting together anyway. The history to me is a little unclear. Maybe somebody could be a little more precise on that timeline than I just was, but all those things happen. Afterwards, he gets another vision. By the way, he also finds a lot of support for these visions from his wife, Emma. You might recall Muhammad's first visions that he receives and how he was supported in this much by his wife, Khadijah. The next vision he has, he's visited in the night by an angel by the name of Moroni. I will make no comment on the fact that this angel's name is Moroni. His name is Moroni. Moroni, I believe, is the proper pronunciation. By the way, if any of my Mormon friends are watching, I apologize. I'm not trying to be overly insensitive or anything like that, but you do have to admit that's a funny name for an angel. Um, he had this vision that he's visited by an angel by the name of Moroni, who declares more about this ancient gospel that had been lost, that God had mentioned to him already. and he is going to show him where to find this. It's going to be all written on these golden plates that had been buried, and the angel Moroni is going to go show him where to find these plates. And these are going to contain a new gospel. And to this point, by the way, the Mormon contention, I believe, much like the Muslim contention, is that the Bible itself has been corrupted. And so I don't think they would be particularly bothered by the gigantic contradiction that the Book of Mormon has with the Bible. When you look at a place like Galatians 1:6, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ Jesus and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preached to you, let him be accursed. I almost think that the Holy Spirit intentionally had it phrased that way when Paul says to the Galatians, even if an angel from heaven preaches to you another gospel, let him be accursed. Because there have been so many religious movements that have started by saying, this is a new gospel that came to me from an angel. That's what you see with Mormons. That's what you see with Islam. Remember, it's the angel Gabriel in Islam. Anyway, it says that there is a angel Moroni. He's going to be the one to show him where these plates are. Moroni claims, by the way, a claim that you often see with Mormonism to show the legitimacy of the book is that supposedly Joseph Smith had such a vast knowledge of Old Testament things. He must have been legitimate because he couldn't have known these things. Couple of things. One, yes, there are a couple of ideas that you see in the Old Testament that show up in the Book of Mormon, which are subtle, which not a whole lot of people know about. The Urim and the Thummim, for example, seer stones that supposedly Smith also had access to, also show up in the Old Testament, and not a lot of people know about them. But, one, people have generally had much greater biblical knowledge then than they do today. It's not outside of the realm of possibility that even somebody who was generally uninterested in the Bible up till this point, like Smith, wouldn't have known about these. Two, superstitious people particularly probably knew a lot about these. They would have been interested in these. Remember, they believe in seer stones, and so they'd be interested in the biblical seer stones. And three, yes, sometimes the Book of Mormon mentions these obscure bits of Old Testament. But then it also says things that are just completely ignorant of how the Bible actually works. And Moroni would be a great example of that because Moroni was supposedly a man who had lived in America, I want to say about 1,000 years before Joseph, a little more than that, but around that time, maybe like 1,300. Well, an angel is not a dead person in the Bible. An angel is its own separate created being, contrary to popular belief. When you die, if you're pleasing to God, and you go to heaven, you're not going to become an angel. You're still a person. You're a person with a celestial body, but you're not a person. You're not an angel. That's a totally different thing. So he didn't understand that. Anyway, this angel Moroni is going to show him where these plates are, and supposedly he ends up unearthing them. The plates were in Reformed Egyptian, a language which, by the way, never existed, and detailed the story of Jews in North America from about 500 BC to 400 AD. And the book, this is the modern version of the Book of Mormon that you will often see. If you are visited by members of the LDS, you almost certainly will be shown this. In fact, that's how I got mine. If you'd like a Book of Mormon for yourself, and I always try to keep opposition material within my library. Like I showed you, I got a Quran. I have Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion back there somewhere. I think it's a good idea to keep opposition material if you're going to be serious in your studies. You should probably have one of these, but you probably shouldn't have to end up paying for it. Just sort of wait. The book itself makes some pretty fantastic claims. It claims that a man named Lehi, who was a Jew during the intertestamental period, or maybe it was towards the end of the close of the Old Testament, not quite sure, No, it must have been. It says 500 BC here, but that's not historically accurate. It must have been that he was coming out of the before the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. He has supposedly escaped from that, sailed to North America, and his descendants end up becoming uh, American Indians. They are they grow up into two different peoples, the Nephites and the Lamanites, and eventually this ends up in a war between the two. Before this war, they have these two different societies, and after Jesus ascends to heaven in the New Testament, he comes over to America to preach to these people as well. The Nephites accept him, the Lamanites do not. As a punishment for not accepting him, God turns the skin of the Lamanites red, and eventually the Nephites were exterminated by the Lamanites. Which is why Moroni, who was the last of the prophets, and he has the last book in the Book of Mormon, he ends up burying the golden plates in which this testament is written, and that's why you don't have any more white Indians. They all have red skin as punishment from God, according to the Book of Mormon, anyway. Smith ends up translating these plates from Reformed Egyptian over into English using the same method he had done before by placing a seer stone in this hat and looking in. And then what he'll do is he'll read from this and have somebody translate. Emma, his wife, was one of the major transcribers, I should say. Another name named Martin Harris, who will be important here in a second, was another one who did this. And that's how supposedly we end up with this book. Not well written. It's full of contradictions. It doesn't have the features that the Bible has, which make it clear it comes from God and not from man. And I think when you just read into it a little bit, it does not have the same effect as the Bible. Literary excellence is not proof necessarily of uh, divine inspiration, but the Bible is a literarily excellent book. And even through translation of a book that at its earliest or at its latest times is 2,000 years old, there's still a certain profoundness to this. The Book of Mormon does not have that same quality. It's written how you would expect somebody who lacks an education in the Bible to write something down that's trying to sound like it's in the Bible, but it's really not. It's written in King James English by someone who doesn't understand how King James English works. For example, from the book of First Nephi, um, look how often it uses the phrase "and it came to pass," which of course does happen in the King James Bible, but it has a reason to do that. First Nephi 4:28. And it came to pass that when Laman saw me, he was exceedingly frightened, and also Lemuel and Sam, and they fled from before my presence, for they supposed it was Laban, and that he had slain me, and had also sought to take away their lives also. And it came to pass that after I called them, and they did hear me, wherefore they did cease to flee from my presence. And it came to pass that when the servant of Laban beheld my brethren, and began to tremble, and was about to flee from before me, and return to the city of Jerusalem, and now I, Nephi, being a man large in stature, and also having received much strength of the Lord, therefore I did seize upon the servant of Laban, and held him that he should not flee. And it came to pass that I spake with him, that he would hearken unto the words, as the Lord liveth, and it keeps doing that sort of thing. It's a difficult thing to read, in a very it's just not well written, which you kind of expect from somebody who's trying. And by the way, a gigantic question: that the year that this is happening, this is in the 1820s. This is being written. People didn't speak that way. They spoke a little bit different than they do now, but not nearly that much. Why is he writing it this way? Because he thinks that's how religious people ought to speak. Because everybody was using a King James Bible. Um, you have a lot of big problems with that. It's full of contradictions. Um, Now, it's claimed that there were 11 witnesses to these golden plates. In fact, at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, it'll probably have a statement by the three witnesses and then later the eight witnesses. And this is sort of the big proving point that the Mormons like to point to for the legitimacy of the Book of Mormon. But these witnesses are not like witnesses you see, for example, in the Bible. For one, you see a whole lot more witnesses to the things that happen in the Bible than just 11. Um, for two, it's a lot of these people ended up leaving. Not you only have 11 witnesses to these golden plates, and a lot more people asked to see the golden plates and never did. Um, you have 11 witnesses, and a lot of them end up leaving the faith, and that's often used by the Mormons as a proof. Look, they left the faith, and they still said that they saw the plates. Well, yeah, because if they did say they didn't see the plates, then they're outing themselves as a liar. Just because they don't want to be a Mormon anymore doesn't mean that they want to lose reputation. I think it's entirely possible that 11 people lied about seeing the plates. I think that's well within the realm of possibility, and when taken into consideration with the rest of the evidence, I think it's pretty clear that's exactly what happened. The first 116 pages that Smith translated in this method ended up getting lost, by the way. I mentioned Martin Harris before. He was the major benefactor for the publishing of the Book of Mormon. He ended up mortgaging his farm so that he could spend, I can't remember exactly how much it was. Somebody said it was the equivalent of $80,000 to get the Book of Mormon published. And he was one of these guys who was very instrumental in writing down these things that Smith was saying. But he ends up taking home the first 116 pages and losing them. Now, it's often speculated that these pages were stolen by Lucy Harris, Martin's wife, in order to prove that Smith was a fraud. She was skeptical of Smith. And you do have this question. Okay, well, if this is really coming from God, then you should be able to do it again. If you're saying you're translating these plates, then this shouldn't be a problem. When Smith finds out that the first 116 pages are lost, he becomes incensed. By the way, these pages were known as the Book of Lehi. That was the man who had sailed over to America initially. Well, when he finds out that these pages have been lost, he becomes incensed, and he says that God told me that I'm no longer allowed to translate the Book of Lehi. However, we still have the Book of Nephi, which covers much of the same stuff that Lehi does, but it's paraphrased. So very conveniently, he is not allowed to translate exactly word for word what happened again, but he's allowed to translate this new book, which is very similar to it. I do need to point out 1 John chapter 4. 1 John chapter 4 says, beginning in verse 1, Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. Contrary to popular belief, Christianity does not teach that we are supposed to blindly believe what the Bible teaches. It says test the Bible. Make sure that what is being said is true. Use your brain. God gave it to you for a reason. Well, Smith ends up testing himself, basically. If he really was a prophet, then he should have been able to keep what was going on before. But very conveniently, God says, no, don't translate what you translated before. I don't know what happened to those 116 pages. And it's a subject of great fascination for a lot of people. But we know this. Nothing that they wrote after that said the exact same thing that those 116 pages did. And that's the mark not of somebody who's from God, but of a liar. As we mentioned, the plates detailed the Nephite civilization and how they came to America. And they make the claim that Jesus came to America to preach after his ascension. After they finally finished translating these plates, and the 11 people besides Smith witnessed them, God takes them back, and so the plates are gone. I've heard it said that maybe the LDS actually still claims to have the plates, but they won't show it to anybody. I've heard different accounts on that. I think the official church line is that the plates were taken back, which also, by the way, brings up a couple of questions. Why did God take away the only account that goes on here? Hard to say. All right. A few things that are mentioned within the plates that we ought to talk about briefly, which are still important in Mormon doctrine. They talk a lot about the celestial life that is important for the afterlife. Smith claimed that Jesus was a created being. I'm sorry, my video's a little bit in the way here. I'm still experimenting, trying to get things just right, so we'll cover up the word celestial life. Smith claimed that Jesus was a creating being who had ascended into godhood. And so he's not actually the Son of God. Remember one of those big things we talked about before? Downplay Jesus. That's a big part of the playbook of cult leaders. Downplay who Jesus was. That way, if Jesus is not so important, I can make myself more important. So Jesus is a created being who ascended to godhood after he did the Father's will. It claims that the highest calling is the family. And family is extremely, of course, the Bible teaches that family is extremely important, but this is even more so. So much so that even God had a wife, or has a wife, according to the Book of Mormon. In Mormon doctrine, families are sealed together. There are ceremonies in which people who are already married, but maybe were married outside of the LDS, or people who are married while they are in the LDS, they have a special sort of marriage that can only happen within a Mormon temple, and it is a sealed marriage. Meaning, for a Mormon, marriage is not till death do us part. Once again, the Bible teaches till death do us part. The Sadducees asked about the resurrection. If a woman had a husband who died, and then she remarried another one, and then that one died, and she remarried another one, and they kept doing that till she'd had a bunch of husbands, and then she died. Whose wife will she be? Jesus said there's none in heaven. They are not married or given in marriage, but they are not angels, but as the angels, in that they have celestial bodies, neither male nor female, meaning there is no marriage in heaven. The relationship that we have, I think marriage is a beautiful, wonderful thing, and it is the greatest physical relationship that you can have on this planet. But the relationship that we will all have with one another in heaven is greater than even that wonderful relationship of marriage. Not so in the LDS, though. Marriage is not till death do us part. It is forever. Your family is forever. Your children are also sealed to you through ceremony in the Mormon faith. They believe that there is no such thing as hell. There are, I believe, three different basically kinds of heaven. And one of those, the greatest one, are for those who were Mormons in life and were good Mormons in life. And if you're really good at it, you also ascend to a type of godhood of your own, and you get to control a world. Sometimes people say that it's a planet. To my understanding, that's not really fair to the Mormon faith, and it's more like your own universe, I guess, where you and your family rule over it, much in the same way that God and his family rule over our universe, according to the Mormon faith. So, yeah, obviously we have a lot of things that are very bizarre and very different from even denominational apostate Christianity. All right. After preaching this for some time in Palmyra, New York, and Smith becomes very popular. Once again, this is a good place to do it. He is gaining this following over here of these very religious but also very superstitious people, and he's sort of married these two things. Of course, these people are really interested in what he has to say. He ends up gathering a lot of people in the town of Kirtland, Ohio, and they end up attempting to build a city called Zion over there, and they build the first Mormon temple there as well, which was strange to the local denominational population who would be focused on having churches. He's hearkening back to that Old Testament temple. It's at this time, once again, this is a place where the sources I saw sort of contradicted. But this is where you first see, supposedly, that the leaders of the church practiced polygamy, which the Mormons were infamous for. And by the way, That's another hallmark of cults. Remember, Muhammad, things got weird sexually. The Anabaptist, things got weird sexually. With Joseph Smith, things got weird sexually. What he claimed was that Moroni revealed to him that he was supposed to have multiple wives, and that he fought against it. He didn't want to have to do it, but much to his wife's disappointment, he ended up having several wives throughout his lifetime. One, who, by the way, was a teenager, while Smith, I believe, was in his 40s. No, that couldn't be right. I think he died at 38. Fine, in his 30s. I'm in my 30s. The thought of having a monogamous relationship with a teenager is sick to me. This guy's, I'm sorry. He fits all the things that you see with cult leaders: sexual perversion, emphasis of the self, downplaying of Jesus. It happens all the time. They begin to build the first temple over there, but they run into problems with the locals. Very aggressive were the Mormons about their belief that they would eventually build a city here and also kick out all the locals. Well, you might imagine the locals were none too happy with that. In addition, they were also pretty worried about the government structure. With all these Mormons coming in, they were afraid that they were essentially going to be forced out of here because the Mormons would put themselves in government and, give themselves all the power in the city. So they eventually get kicked out of Kirtland, Ohio. Oh, it's also at this time, I think some of the more major leaders of the movement show up. I think this is when Sidney Rigdon. No, Sidney Rigdon goes all the way back to Palmyra, doesn't he? This is when Brigham Young shows up, though. So it grew in Kirtland, Ohio, and everybody starts going over there. Well, eventually they get kicked out by the locals and end up in the same county as Independence, Missouri. If you ever played Oregon Trail, you know Independence, Missouri. This is where this was sort of the western frontier of America at that time. They conflict with the locals for similar reasons. However, things got a lot more violent here than it did in Kirtland. It was violent on both parts of the Mormons and the locals. The Mormons did not preach pacifism. These were not Quakers. And so they would fight back as well. And there was a lot of bloodshed by done both by and to the Mormons. The governor of Missouri eventually put out an extermination order on the Mormons. That sounds really bad, but it only goes into effect if they refuse to leave. They were given a few months to leave, and that's what they do. They end up going to Illinois, who saw the lawmakers in Illinois, among whom was Abraham Lincoln at this time. They saw Missouri as being really unfriendly to the Mormons, and so they sold them a piece of land in which they could build their city in Illinois. Oh, I almost forgot to mention in Missouri, by the way, while Smith was away from Independence, he made a prediction that had been revealed to him that this was going to be the location of Zion forever. It would be right on the border of the Lamanites. Remember, that's American Indians, which is right at the western frontier, so Independence, Missouri. It would be right there at the border of the Lamanites forever. Unbeknownst to him, this is right when the Mormons were being kicked out of that place. Deuteronomy 18:22 gives instructions to the people of Israel that when they are hearing somebody claiming to be a prophet, you don't just immediately take that guy's word for it. You test him. How do you test him? See if his predictions come true. If you don't, he's not a prophet. Smith had predictions that did not come true. He was just wrong, and he was wrong a lot. Well, they end up fleeing there. They end up going to Illinois. They're allowed to establish their own city here, and so that makes it a little bit easier on them. They call it Nauvoo. It was a Hebrew word, and the meaning of the word Nauvoo escapes me at the moment. They were granted land in Illinois. They built the city of Nauvoo. They also built a temple here. However, the situation sours for them as well because they start doing other things. Whenever the Mormons started practicing polygamy, by the time you get to Nauvoo, everybody in the country knows about it. And in addition to that, they start training their own militia. Smith is the personal head of that militia. He ends up running for president as well, and so all of this, he's getting in some hot water with the locals in Illinois. The final straw is when this practice of polygamy was made known to the world at large. Many of the Mormons ended up leaving the mainline faith, including one who decided to set up a newspaper. I believe it was called the Nauvoo Expositor. It only ever had one issue, and it was criticizing Smith, particularly for the practice of polygamy. Smith was so incensed that he ended up destroying the printing press that it was printed on, which is why there was only ever one issue of the Nauvoo Expositor. And it was also a clear violation of the Expositor's First Amendment rights. So he ends up being arrested for treason, and he's taken to Carthage, Illinois. Now, from this point on, the pro-Mormon sources sort of differentiate from the more hostile to Mormon sources. So I'll tell you both versions of the story. The Mormon version is that Smith goes willingly to be taken to the jail. They take him to the second floor of the jail along with a few of the other Mormon leaders, and then a angry mob ends up storming the jail and shooting Smith several times, and he ends up falling out the window dead. The anti-Mormon version of it is that he's arrested. I don't know if the anti-Mormon version... I like when my light goes off in the middle of these things. It makes me look really silly, and I get to say hi to everybody. The anti-Mormon version is that he didn't go willingly to his own arrest, and that he was, yes, taken to the jail, and an angry mob showed up and shot at him, but rather than be shot, he was nearly missed, and he just jumped out the window, and that's how he died. So maybe the truth's somewhere in the middle, who knows. Point is, Smith's dead now, and it actually strengthens the movement. It makes a martyr out of him. And this is when you see Brigham Young really show up in prominence. Initially, there was a lot of division within the Mormons about what to do after Smith died. But Brigham Young, he ends up having this more disciplinary leadership style. He was harsher than Smith. A few of the Mormons leave. A decent group under Emma Smith ends up leaving. And one of Joseph Smith's children also leads that group. But Young ends up taking them to outside of the United States. He is infamous for codifying some of the, and by the way, just so you know, now extinct LDS doctrines, but at the time they were very important, such as polygamy. Polygamy being very important. And rather than keeping this secretly like his predecessors had, he says that this is the best thing that somebody can do. And justifying it using the Bible. Abraham had several wives. Well, by the way, how did that go for Abraham? Didn't work out particularly well. Just because a good guy does something in the Bible doesn't mean that's a good thing to do. David was a good guy in the Bible. He also committed adultery with his neighbor's wife and killed him in order to keep that quiet. Was that something we all ought to be doing, or was this a good man who was sinning and through God's mercy was later redeemed? I think you can say the same thing about Abraham. This was a good man who was sinning, and then later he was redeemed. But anyway, Young ends up codifying the practice of polygamy. I believe, as far as I can tell, he was also the one to really codify the refusal of black men into the priesthood. And you might think that the priesthood is a very high office within Mormonism. It's not. Basically, a priest in Mormonism is the head of a family, so a husband or a father. And if you can't be a priest, you got a serious problem if you're in that position in life. And the reason was, supposedly, black people bore the mark of Cain. This was a common belief back in the day, that black skin was a curse, the mark of Cain. Some believed that this was the curse that was put upon Ham after the flood, The Mormons believed it was the mark of Cain. And the big question, of course, is then, well, how come after the deluge you have you still have black people if it's the mark of Cain? And the Mormon answer to this is black people were allowed to exist after the flood so that Satan would have a representative on earth. So for a very long time, until the year 1978, the official stance of the Mormon Church was that black people were the representatives of Satan on earth. By the way, I don't know how much of the doctrine of that has actually changed. I know the effect of it has changed. Black people are allowed to do anything else that white people can within the Mormon Church. But I don't know if the doctrine that they bore the mark of Cain is gone. Someone could correct me if I'm wrong on that. He led the main group of Mormons, the LDS, out of the U.S. territory and into Salt Lake City, Utah. It was extremely dangerous. Many Mormons died along the way for various reasons. But once they established themselves in Salt Lake City, they had about 1 year of isolation. At that time, Utah was a territory of Mexico, but after a year, the U.S. won the Mexican-American War and annexed Utah. Now, they initially tried to make a few concessions. For one, they had Brigham Young be the governor of Utah. So, you're our territory, but you can keep running your cult if you want to. It was essentially the U.S. Idea about it. But Young ended up waging a guerrilla war against the United States during this time. The most famous incident from this war was known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Like I said, it's a guerrilla warfare, so they were trying to keep things very quiet, and it's hard to tell whether Young himself ordered this. By the way, Young was also a polygamist, and he was also a pedophile, much like Smith. But one of the things that happened during this time is there was a wagon train passing through Utah, not trying to stay in Utah, just trying to go through further west. But the Mormons were extremely paranoid of any American intervention. Young had already sort of given the okay to the local Native American tribes. They were allowed to raid caravans, and this group in Mountain Meadows, they began to be raided as well. At first, they thought it was from American Indians, and it turned out no, it was actually the Mormons. And the Mormons eventually stopped the siege, and this is a wagon train. You think about them circling up and all of that. Eventually, the Mormons tricked them, told them that it was Indians that had been fighting them, and that they had managed to convince them to let up, but you have to lay down all of your arms, and we'll escort you out of this area. And they do, and they give a signal, and the Mormon men who were there, they end up wheeling around and shooting all of the men of that company. They shoot the wounded, they kill the women, and they kill all the children who are older than 8 years old. The children who are 8 years old and younger, they end up kidnapping. And as far as I could tell, it seemed to indicate that they were then raised as Mormons. That was certainly the most infamous. I can't remember how many people died in that, but it was over 100, if I'm not mistaken. So you have a pretty nasty business over there. But eventually the Mormons began to try to assimilate into American society after the death of Young. They abandoned formally the practice of polygamy as part of the deal for achieving statehood for the state of Utah. There are still a few splinter groups of Mormons who practice polygamy, but the main line don't. In the 20th century, they begin to present themselves more as a Christian denomination rather than an entirely new religion. One of the things you can see for that, for example, on the Book of Mormon, the original printings of this did not say another testament of Jesus Christ. They did not focus much on Jesus Christ as they do now today. And they did that to make them seem less of different than mainline Christianity. This is when they start. The stereotypical picture of a Mormon before this was a bearded polygamist. This is when you start getting the idea of the extremely clean cut guy, very young guy as well, and they end up assimilating very much into American society. A few distinctive doctrines that we have not mentioned include baptism for the dead. This would be another place. I believe Smith taught people to do this. Um, and this would be another place where you've misunderstood the scriptures and you've kind of shown your hand that you don't really understand what you're dealing with here. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 29, Paul does mention the baptism of the dead, but the context about it, he says, what is the purpose then? If there is no resurrection, what's the purpose of baptizing for the dead? And so Smith sees that and says, oh, they must have been baptizing for the dead back then. No, Paul, yes, people were baptizing for the dead, but they weren't supposed to be. Paul is answering a fool according to his folly. He is saying that the same people who are teaching that there is no resurrection of the dead are baptizing people in place of people who have already died. And he says, if there's no resurrection, what on earth is the point of that? Which is a good question to ask. And but Mormons do practice the baptism for the dead. And so you have, remember, you have those different worlds of an afterlife. Well, somebody might have Mormonism preached to them in an afterlife, and they want to be baptized, but their body can't. Well, that's why they do this. You're going to baptize for the dead. The Mormons landed themselves in some hot water a few years ago for this practice when they baptized on behalf of Holocaust victims. And they eventually made some sort of settling over there. I believe that the deal was we're not going to baptize for Jews anymore unless their families specifically request it. Which is a bizarre thing, by the way, if you really believe that this is bringing people salvation. You wouldn't think that somebody's offense is all it would take to make you not do that anymore. Um, they refuse substances, so we're not taking drugs, we're not drinking alcohol, we're not smoking. What makes the Mormons unique on this one, though, is they won't even, and this was Smith's rule, they won't even take hot drink, which is understood to be caffeine. So no coffee, no tea either. Um, and by the way, like I said, if you're studying with one of these people, because they, of course, very famously come to you, um, you if you are still not 100% sure if you're dealing with somebody who's of that main line or not, that might be a good little trick there is to, it's not all that deceptive, but just ask, hey, would you like some coffee or tea? And if they refuse to drink it, that might be somebody who's in the LDS. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. The missionary system that they use, and of course they're very famous for this. It's easy to remember the system because everything's in twos. You start with very young men, although recently they've started having young women do this. The last time I studied with Mormons who came to me, it was actually a couple of young women. They didn't knock on my door. They contacted me through Facebook, but that's how we studied. It was two young women. But normally it will be young men. They'll pick them out, and they are sent to a 2-year mission field where they are supposed to go preach for those 2 years. During that time, they are not going to get to go see their parents. These are usually starting off as teenagers, by the way, and they're going through a pretty rough experience. No TV, no radio, no internet, unless explicitly permitted. The two have to be together at all times, and the only time you aren't in sight of your mission partner is when you're using the bathroom. Oh, and by the way, you don't get to choose who your mission partner is. They're going through a rough time. If you get some Mormons ringing your doorbell, and by the way, take that as an opportunity to study with them, and also I try to be sympathetic for them. They're going through a rough time. Um, it's a good chance to try to study with them. They're also kind of famous for some of their temple rituals. Baptism for the dead is included in there. That picture, by the way, is a artist rendition of what the inside of the Mormon temple in Salt Lake City, Utah, looks like. and you have all these really bizarre rituals, that sealing rituals or the baptism rituals. A lot of things going on there. Finally, the hierarchy of the Mormons. The family is extremely important in Mormonism. The father or the husband, they hold the priesthood in the family. And so the family kind of requires the father in order to be able to get to God. You have counselors who sort of act as preachers for the meeting halls. But meeting halls are just sort of a concession. The real churches are sort of the temples. And those are head up by bishops. At the very top of it, when you get to the temple in Salt Lake City, you have 12 apostles. And I'm skipping a few ranks here. It's more complex than this. But you do have 12 living apostles because it's asserted by Mormonism that there must always be 12 living apostles somewhere on earth. So, according to Mormons, by the way, even before Smith discovered the Book of Mormon, apparently there were 12 living apostles somewhere on earth. And at the very top, you have the president, and that's who we have pictured here, is the current Mormon president, whose name escapes me at the moment. It was Russell something, but I can't remember exactly who it is. Oh, hey, Shane Fisher. There's a new book that just called out how the Book of Mormon came to pass. I recommend it because the author makes new connections in regards to the Spalding-Rigdon theory of the origin of the Book of Mormon. What Shane's talking about, by the way, is the idea that Smith really wasn't the originator of it, but Sidney Rigdon, who I mentioned earlier, was the actual writer. Um, and that is an interesting theory out there. I'm not sure all the conclusions, but we shall see. Um, Russell Nelson, thank you, Shane. He also said, did a 35-part series on how the Book of Mormon originated. It needs some revision after reading through this book. Wow, 35-part series, man. Good on you. That's a lot of work. Um, yeah. All right. Anyway, let's. As I mentioned at the beginning, I don't normally do so much of this, but because Mormonism is so uniform, you still can't really pigeonhole them. Don't pigeonhole them even with people who are this uniform in their beliefs. That being said, you're going to see so much of the same thing over and over again with it. And so I feel like I can give you a couple of pieces of advice with studying with Mormons. One, you're almost certainly going to get the opportunity at some point. A Christian ought to be going to people and saying and trying to study the Bible with them. I don't think the Mormon system is particularly effective, especially in places like America where there's a general disinterest in religion. Whenever I go over to Africa, my system does look a little bit more like the Mormon system. I'm not exactly door knocking per se, but I've had plenty of impromptu discussions with people who've invited me into their home. That doesn't happen so much in America, and I don't think that's the most efficient way of going about it. Usually, it's more efficient to talk with people you know and try to make that connection. Um, but they're going to be if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, would you like to talk about Jesus?" Man, your answer better be yes. That's an important thing, and that's my answer. Now, normally I try to do things slowly, and so I ideally have several studies or several sessions of a Bible study. It's not all at once, at least in the strategy. I mean, maybe things will go so well, we'll get everything in one session, which is fantastic. But from a strategical level, I don't aim for that usually. With the Mormons, I do. And the reason why is because I need to have a certain level of control in this study that I don't normally demand in other studies. My first few studies with almost anybody, I'm doing a lot more listening than I'm doing talking because I want to make sure I understand what somebody is saying, and I want to make them feel like they have been heard, and I want to make them feel like we're not having a conversion experience, but we're having a discussion, which is, by the way, what you should be doing. I mean, if we have the truth, discussion should get us there. Um, in the case of Mormons, the reason I'm not so keen on that is because they are coming with a very specific agenda, which is they want to convert me. They don't want to have a discussion, they want to convert me. And so my goal is a little bit different than it normally is. I am very doubtful that I'm going to be able to say anything to somebody in that mind state at that time that is going to cause them to leave the Mormon religion. Keep in mind, by the way, once again, these are kids. They have all the family, these are teenagers, young 20s at the oldest, usually. And, um, oh, Shane again. I wrote a book entitled Questions About Mormon Doctrine. It's available on worldevangelismlibrary.com. It has helped to convert 2 LDS I'm aware of. Questions are good to ask LDS to help them to think. Hey, I'll check that out. Thank you, Shane. Appreciate it. Um, the you have somebody who's trying to convert you at the moment. So my goal is not necessarily to get them to come to full understanding. I don't think I am. My goal really is to try to say something that's going to bother them, something that's going to bother them for years, right? I always say you never really convert anybody. People convert themselves, and sometimes that takes a long time. And so when I'm there, I'm not necessarily thinking I'm going to end up with me baptizing these people. Um, but maybe I can plant or water a little bit, and somebody else along the way can water a little bit more, and maybe somewhere down the line God will give the increase. So I want to say something that can bother them. These kids, all of their relations on their whole mission right now is all about this one thing. They are deprived of any sort of entertainment in life. They are deprived of any companionship except for the one person who is also assigned to do the exact same thing. They are not in an open mental state. It is intentionally designed that way. Um, but later in life, they might be a little bit more open to it, and they might be thinking, "Man, the one guy said really bothers me." And here's a few things you can say to bother. One, take more control of it than you normally would. Last time I talked with them, the opening was, "What's your favorite Bible verse?" Okay, they want to talk about the Bible. Next time Mormon speaks with me, I'm going to try to flip it on them pretty quickly. Why are you a Mormon? And they're not going to say it's because I was raised in the Mormon faith, which is usually the answer. Um, but they are going to talk about their experiences. There's a good chance they're going to say something along the lines of, "Well, I prayed to God to show me whether or not the Book of Mormon was true, and I was suddenly awash with such a strong spiritual feeling, I knew it had to be true." I like to play that off of other denominational doctrines. The Mormons believe, remember, all denominations are false. And so I'll say something like, the Pentecostals believe something very similar. They believe that they had a religious experience that, um, that showed them that this is what they ought to be doing, that they are right with God. The holiness movement, the entire sanctification, a lot of times that will be interpreted in that way. If you weren't studying with me and you were studying with somebody else, and they said that to you, what would you tell them? Now, they'll probably figure out where you're going with this at that point. If they don't, and you have to spell it out for them, whenever they finish with that, you ask, okay, how does any of that, all of that, not apply to you? And what they'll probably say, they probably won't say that they're lying. I don't think Mormons are lying when they say they had that experience. But what they will probably say is that, that's not necessary. A feeling, anything can cause a feeling. I've had warm, fuzzy feelings from music before, right? Um, the mind is a fragile thing, and it can be manipulated in such a way as to cause somebody to think something's not happening if you're just basing your ideas off feelings. We don't gather our truth from feelings. That's appeal to emotion. We gather our truth from evidence. You might point out a couple of the things where the evidence of the Book of Mormon just is not there. Um, there's a good chance they'll probably accuse you of being hostile. They won't say it in such a way, but if they make that accusation, and they're always really nice, by the way, I appreciate that about them. They're always super nice, but in a very nice way, they'll accuse you of being hostile to them. And when they do, you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. What did I say that was hostile?" And if you've done things right, hopefully all they'll be able to do is hem and haw about that, because you shouldn't be being hostile about it, but it's not hostile to point out the problems with that, the difficulties. Even truth has difficulties in it. that you have to be able to defend, but if you have the truth, being asked to do so shouldn't bother you. So I would say from the normal strategies with Bible studies, a lot of the normal ones kind of go out the window when I'm studying with Mormons. I only do one session, by the way. I don't take it over a lot of them. I only do one session. I don't waste any more time than that. My goal in that session is, I mean, once again, I'm happy to baptize them if they realize this isn't what we ought to be doing, but it's just probably not going to happen in that environment. So my goal is not to try to fully convert them in that moment. My goal is to say something that is going to bother them for the rest of their life, such as, Smith made false predictions. The Book of Mormon contradicts itself. Um, Smith was an immoral man. He was a pervert, etc., etc. And the Bible, which does have these things, which the Book of Mormon doesn't. It is without contradiction, and it says that there is not going to be any other gospel, or that your experience of salvation was a exact same experience of salvation for a lot of people that you say are not saved. Whatever you can say on that, when they leave, and by the way, I mentioned it's only one session, but when they are leaving, ideally, they're leaving of their own volition. I'm not kicking them out. They don't want to be here anymore because I'm saying stuff that they don't want to hear. Not insults. Not make them know you love them. That's so important with all of this. You need love in every single bit of it. I love Mormons, which is why I want to see them out of this apostasy. But I want them leaving remembering two things. One, this person said something that's bothering me a lot and I can't get over it. And then maybe later in life, it just can't be true. And two, you want them to remember not necessarily who you were, not necessarily your name, but remember that you are a part of the Church of Christ. Not one of these denominations, but the Church of Christ. And maybe you will have planted a seed that somebody else later can water, and maybe God will give the increase. So those are just a few ideas I have when it comes to studying with Mormons. Oh boy, this was a long one. I really appreciate you hanging in there with me. Next week, we're going to talk about the Millerite movement. Until then, looking forward to it. Love you all, and you have a great week.